When I first read The Handmaid's Tale about 8 years ago now, I was but a young boy, not really used to capital L literature. I was blown away by a uniquely powerful book that kind of succinctly covers themes such as gender and power dynamics and ecofeminism, as well as the complexities of both history and narratives and our responsibility towards them. Coming back to it this year through my challenge to read all of Atwood's major works, I'm struck even further by how unprecedented a piece of writing it was in the context of her previous novels. My name's Eddie. This is a series that I'm doing on Margaret Atwood. If this is your first time watching, come in, join the fun, drag up a pew. Is that the phrase? This is not a spoiler-free review, so bear that in mind before we get started. Okay, The Handmaid's Tale is a story of Offred, a woman living in the late 1900s in the town that used to be Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our main character is a handmaid, a fertile woman who has been forced to be a kind of surrogate for the rich and wealthy people in this new theocratic or religiously run society. Specifically, in this case, she is the handmaid of a woman called Fred, hence of Fred, after a military coup in which the government and the president were assassinated and replaced with a kind of strict orthodox biblical society. This new state, known as the Republic of Gilead, is all-encompassing. It kind of weaves its way into every facet of people's lives. This society is specifically structured on gender lines. They use a network of spies called the Eyes to report on the behaviour of people who are now seen as subversive elements, whether that's Catholic priests, whether that's abortionists in the previous life, or whether that is people who they call gender traitors, members of the LGBTQ+ community. Handmaids such as Offred wear quite distinctive, like long red dresses and these white wings that kind of restrict their vision, but also restrict people from looking in at them. They, like all women in the new state, are not able to read, to write, to even own property. Even commanders' wives are unable to work in this context and are kind of restricted to the household sphere. Offred's commander's wife, Serena Joy, used to be a television personality back in the day, like a TV evangelist who was kind of trying to bring this new state into being and was successful in a way. She's very hostile to Offred, as many of the wives are to the handmaids. Handmaids' lives are pretty repetitive. They go to the shops every day in pairs to pick up food that was picked out for them by Marthas, who are another class of women in this new society. Once a month they take part in the ceremony, a perversion of the biblical story of Rachel and Bela, in which the commander tries to impregnate the handmaid who is laying between the legs of his own wife. Whilst recounting the everyday details of her life in Gilead, Offred also talks about the events that happened in her life prior to the coup. This includes talking about her husband Luke, with whom she had a daughter. The three of them tried to escape together, and now Luke is missing or dead, and Offred doesn't know where her daughter is. She also talks about her best friend Moira, who was a gay social activist. She also tells of her time in the Red Centre with Moira, an indoctrination centre set up by Gilead in order to turn people into the perfect handmaids. These were led by a woman named Aunt Lydia and involved bullying, physical and mental abuse, and use of video footage showing the horrors of pre-Gilead life for women, in an attempt to convince them that this is a new, better way forward. Moira conducts an incredible escape from the centre, kind of knocking out one of the aunts and putting on her outfit and just walking straight out the door. Back in the present, Offred is surprised when Nick, the chauffeur, tells her that the commander wants to see her in his private rooms. This is completely banned. They're not really meant to have any contact at all outside of the monthly ceremonies. She expects some kind of perverted sex thing, but instead she finds that he wants to play Scrabble with her. As someone that's not able to read anymore, let alone play word-based board games, she finds herself taking up the chance. He doesn't seem to want anything at first other than a single kiss at the end of the session. This illicit affair continues and he starts bringing her gifts to read, including magazines and just more general books. Meanwhile, it's revealed that the woman that she has been walking to the shops with every day, the other handmaid, Offglen, is actually a member of the resistance, the May Day movement. She asks Offred for information on her commander. Eventually the commander becomes bolder with Offred, and he sneaks her outside of the assigned area in which she's allowed to go to a kind of illicit club, which reveals that the moral leaders of this movement are maybe a little bit less moral than they're letting on. She runs into Moira there, who's been working there as one of the women, and she kind of reveals to her what happened in her escape attempt. She manages to get onto the female railroad, a network of kind of safe houses trying to get women out of the country and into Canada. She was captured at the border, and Offred is distressed that someone that she'd been holding out for as a kind of a beacon of hope for her has actually already been captured and re-assimilated into the system. Simultaneously to this strange relationship with the commander, Serena Joy approaches Offred and says, look, for all we know, it may be the commander was unable to have children. Given that and how important it is to Offred that she has kids, this is her last chance to do so before she's sent to the colonies, why not have sexual relationship on the side with Nick the chauffeur? She does so, but in contrast with her transactional relationship with the commander, Offred finds herself getting attached to Nick and even starts to feel like she is cheating on her husband, Luke, and she becomes convinced that she's actually become pregnant by him. One day following a partisecution event in which Offglen intercedes to kind of mercy kill someone but she knows is part of her underground network, a new Offglen greets Offred when she goes down to the door to begin her daily walks. She informs her that the previous Offglen had been rumbled and killed herself before she was able to be captured by the Eyes. Eventually, Offred's relationship with the commander is revealed. Before Serena Joy can inform on her, the Eyes arrive at the house. Nick promises Offred that this is actually the Resistance that has arrived and that she should go with them and that she'll be safe with them. She gets into the car and we end the main part of the novel. Cool. Just before people start going, oh, what about the historical notes? Lads, we'll get there. Don't worry about it. But first, it'll be difficult talking about The Handmaid's Tale without talking about gender, power dynamics, and the policing of women's bodies that is central to this novel. A key element of this novel is how totalitarianism, in this case in the form of a strict gendered society, manages to break down identity and force you into a position of complicity. Offred initially refuses to call the room that's been assigned to her mine. However, she later calls it exactly that after a troubling interaction with the commander. As Stillman and Johnson know, this eventually transitions into her referring to the house as ours. And then finally there's the admission that everything that they taught at the Red Centre, everything I've resisted, comes flooding in. They can do what they like with me. Even her core values, her relationship with Luke and her daughter, are tainted by Gilead. With her affair of Nick and her mixed feelings when she finally is able to be shown a picture of her daughter by Serena Joy. This breakdown of identity shows how intrusive totalitarianism is, how much it seeps into your very being. Offred herself is not even named in this story. It seems likely that her name is probably June, given that she lists out 5 names at the end of the first chapter, and the only one that doesn't come up later in the narrative is June. But obviously this is another way in which it's shown by Atwood that identity is erased by this system. We see in this narrative how desperate she is just to have kind of touch or really day-to-day interaction, any kind of affection from anyone in this society. One thing that really comes through is the utter boredom of living in this kind of state. She has nothing to do all day. Unfortunately, this society is structured specifically in a way to prevent solidarity between women. Marthas, the women who are kind of the serving class, aren't really meant to interact with handmaids and are kind of encouraged to look down on them. Wives often sit apart from them in a clump together, and again they gossip about them behind their backs. They're meant to treat them as less than human. They're in sole charge of discipline for these women, and more than one reference is made to a wife kind of physically abusing or even killing a handmaid. Although the latter is banned, it should be said. Religious ritual is further used to separate them. There's a full range of these, including the ceremony itself, which is based on a story in the Bible in which Jacob and Rachel are unable to conceive children, so Bilhah is offered by God as a surrogate for Rachel. Coincidentally enough, women aren't able to read the Bible in this novel. They're kept under lock and key in little boxes. Phrases such as "blessed are the meek" somehow seem to get divorced from the second half of that phrase, which is "for they shall inherit the earth." Doesn't seem to get brought up in the classes led by Aunt Lydia. On top of this, in the ceremony, there are also events such as the partisecution, a combination of participation and execution, in which handmaids are essentially used as capital punishment. This is used to further tie them in and their thinking into the logic of the state. One thing worth mentioning, that the gender dynamics in this novel are specifically between white women and white men. African Americans, referred to as sons of Ham in the novel as kind of a reference to the Bible, are sent off to a national homeland where they're forced to live. Likewise, Jewish people, or sons of Jacob, are given the choice of either converting or being shipped off in boats to Israel. Some critics have criticised this decision to focus exclusively on white men and white women, given that the narrative arguably borrows a lot from slave narratives, that genre of writing. The Handmaid's Tale too fits neatly into Atwood's ecofeminist leanings. The central backdrop to the novel is a crisis in fertility. This, is explained, did not have one concrete reason behind it. Nonetheless, there is reference to pollution, water pollution, to specific kind of variants of viruses that infect people, and environmental degradation really does underpin the world of this novel. Furthermore, women who have the misfortune of being infertile and old are shipped off to colonies, and these colonies are sites of environmental meltdown, maybe potentially nuclear meltdown, or just massive environmental degradation. It's kind of said that the people that are shipped out there are only going to have like 3 years to live max. This includes Offred's mother in the novel, who is a passionate, committed feminist who did a lot of campaigning back in her day and was previously talking to Offred about how their generation was, not doing enough, but they were letting things slide. Being sent to work in a toxic waste site for the rest of your life is a hell of a way to be vindicated. These themes of ecofeminism will be drawn out more by Atwood in some of her later novels, but here play a larger part of a theme of a novel that we kind of ignore what is going on around us until it's too late. Well ahead of the curve on that one, Atwood. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fascinating 15 or so pages that follow the main body of the novel, that's kind of listed as historical notes. My girlfriend actually didn't realise this was part of the novel and then didn't read it the first time she read this book. They're a lecture delivered on June 25th, 2195 by Professor James Darcy Piagiotto, I think. We'll go with that. He's a foremost scholar on what we now know to be a historical document known as The Handmaid's Tale. Indeed, it was named as such by him and another lecturer. This novel, that until this point we've kind of taken as a face value retelling of Offred's experiences, turn out actually to be a series of tapes in which an oral history was recorded, and that was found by these researchers many decades, centuries later. They were discovered having been stashed in Bagna in what used to be known as Maine. This part of the novel was really interesting for a number of reasons, especially to someone who studied a history degree like I did. Firstly, most straightforwardly, we get a little bit more extra info about the characters in the novel, possibly. The commander is revealed to either be Commander Fred Waterford or Commander Fred Judd, though the former seems far more likely given he worked in marketing before the Gilead era, and this is something that he mentioned to Offred in the novel. He, it turns out, is behind much of the branding of Gilead, including the red robes, which he borrowed from German prisoners of war, and the particution kind of portmanteau. We also find out that there's no record of Offred's escape. Like, this oral account is as much as we get for her. We can only speculate why these tapes were in Maine. Potentially she was on the female railroad, which the scholars have very humorously started referring to as the Frail Road. Hopefully she escaped, but we have no evidence of this really. These could have been something that she was kind of tortured into saying. It could have been done by the eyes in order to discredit Commander Waterford, who we find out has been purged not long after the events of this novel. These complementary facts to the novel do add more insight into the potential narrative, especially references to countries such as Romania, who we know that Atwood used as an inspiration to develop this novel. Indeed, in the past, she said that everything included in this novel was something that was taken from a real-world example, obviously in a big way inspired by Reagan-era politics and the anti-abortion campaigns during that time, but yeah, also through various different examples of countries throughout the world. This is why Atwood refers to this novel as speculative rather than science fiction, though some critics have been a bit like, is there really a difference between these two genres? Alongside providing more colour, however, this part of the novel also is in itself interesting to look at from a perspective of the idea of history and narratives and the responsibility we have to people in the past. Throughout the lecture, he's clear that judging the past is not the duty of historians. And yet, he kind of definitely feels incredibly judgy throughout this part of the novel. Like, the entire lecture hall is laughing through discussions of this, through talking about something that's incredibly traumatising to the people that live through it. He discusses with great relish the ingenuity of Waterford and Judd, and kind of complains how disappointing it is that the narrative that Offred tells doesn't spend more time delving into kind of the everyday working of Commander Waterford's life, like what he would give to have access to those documents that he had. When she says during the novel that we live in the gaps between the stories, she can't have known that this is what was coming, but it sure does feel pertinent. The story can't even stand on its own as the act of defiance it was meant to be 2 centuries later. Instead, it's something for academics to chatter over and discuss the provenance of. It's worth noting that the lecture takes part in Deny None of It, which is, deny none of it, puns. It's a commentary on the academic environment during Atwood's time, specifically to do with academic commentary on Puritanism and the founding of America. The notion that historians valorize the past despite the deeply problematic, often specifically gendered structures that are in place. Even in a place where Offred's voice is centered, it's kind of stripped of everything that's unique and about her and kind of only used for what's useful for their research. There's also a hint of naivety at this point, right? Like they're talking as if this is something that's in the distant past, but we know from academics having commented during the pre-Gilead period that you never know when something like this is about to come up on you. So this kind of high and mighty, above it all position they take is one that Atwood is clearly skewering here. They're ignoring Offred's warning that nothing changes instantaneously. In a gradually heating bathtub, you'd be boiled to death before you knew it. And yet this novel is not a dystopia, it's more like what Ketterer calls a contextual dystopia, which is an interesting distinction, I think, because we actually see what happens after the dystopia, something that's quite rare in novels, something that is quite interesting. Like, the Republic of Gilead does fail eventually, but for the characters living in it, it might as well be endless. It might as well be a permanent dystopia. The Handmaid's Tale, in my opinion, is a really good book. What's interesting to me is that while you can clearly see it's a novel written by the same woman that wrote The Edible Woman and Surfacing in her other early novels, it still feels such a drastically different change. It still feels such a big step forward that comes almost out of nowhere, especially given it follows Bodily Harm, which is one of my least favourite Atwood novels. It also opens the door to Atwood's later novels, which fully engage more with speculative ideas and ideas surrounding ecofeminism, which I hope you stick around to check out with me later on. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you subscribe, stick around, come join the fun. Going to be going through all of her major works, so get involved. Yeah, let me know what you thought of this novel in the comments down below. Alright, thank you. Bye-bye.